I don't irritate you by the end of this hour, I've failed in this, because I'm going to be talking about some of the characteristics that we're seeing in students and what that's going to mean in terms of teaching. And some of it you're not, especially faculty, are not going to want to hear. But I want to try to leave enough time for questions and dodging tomatoes, which Randy said she brought. So no, you won't throw them in this room. Okay. I do a lot of talks around, and even if people disagree with me, they're usually polite. I'm in serious trouble here because you guys don't have to be polite to me. I'd like starting out with talking about a particular fantasy of mine, but because I'm a geek, this fantasy is not going to be all that interesting. But when I'm flying airplanes, I fantasize that Benjamin Franklin appears next to me, and then I have the opportunity, once he gets a shower, to take him around and show him how the world has changed since he was alive, and some of which he's responsible for. But of course, this would be a little bit of future shock to him. So I'd also want to take him to places that really haven't changed since he died. So obviously, I take him to Congress, which is what's the old joke: if pro is the opposite of con, what's the opposite of progress? You got it. But I'd also take him to almost any university, because in a real sense, we haven't changed much in what we do. That's about to change. Because, well, put it this way. We look at, this is sort of our lives. I'm a little older than you, so maybe subtract 10 years. But in terms of looking at change in our lives, it has been obviously increasing, but it's been relatively gradual. It's been pretty linear. This is what Mark Prensky calls the singularity, what some other people might call the tipping point. When we started about in the early 90s, mid-90s, basically digitizing content and delivering it that way. Since then, the pace of change has dramatically increased. So we're here. Sorry, we don't have that many down here. This should be a little higher. Put another story on this room, okay? People like Prensky, who's a futurist, say that from this point on, it's going to increase significantly in our lives. And he argues by the year 2040, the amount of computing power will increase by a factor of not a million, but a billion. So whenever you hear anybody talk about what's going to happen in 20 years, you can't talk about what's going to happen in more than 5 years because of the rapid change. The point I'm trying to make here is that this is our imprint. It's what Prensky calls we're digital immigrants. We lived in this world, and now we're living in this world. So that feeling of, oh my God, this is changing so fast, whatever, that's because we had this experience here, and now we're going through this. The point to be made, though, is that this is our story. This is our pattern. This is our students' patterns. Okay? This is the pattern of a digital native. My favorite definition of technology is anything that was invented after you were born. Another way of putting it, if you can remember using it, the first time you used it, it's technology. So we were all born into worlds of phones. You don't see a motel saying, we have phones. Well, in 5 years, you're not going to see a sign saying, we have DSL. But students are used to a pattern of change that we're not used to. They accept that change much more readily than we do. I'll start off with the technology, and usually, and especially in academic audiences, you say, okay, now the technology is secondary. Learning principles are first. Okay, then we look at technology. Yeah, yes and no. There's a wonderful book out. I'll talk about the book in just a minute. This is one of the reasons technology is changing. The computers are getting more powerful now almost every year. So, yeah, anything you buy now is going to be far less powerful than what is going to be out there when what you bought is delivered. This saves you money. This costs you money. The pipe through which we can send information is increasing significantly, very rapidly. And you add to these what's called the law of disruption. says, okay, how fast does change happen? Well, we have to unpack change. In terms of politics and administration, change happens slowest. It's very incremental. Business change is slow, social change is faster, but the fastest change is technology. Here's our problem. Technology is changing at an extraordinarily quick rate, but our ability to manage it and deal with it is basically filled with inertia. And administrators are feeling this. They're feeling that things are just racing by them, and they cannot cope with the speed of that change. And why I wanted to talk about technology first is that, yeah, I'm going to talk about learning principles, but we have to understand that there is a fundamental driving force here, and part of that is technology. There's a wonderful book called Natural Born Cyborgs by Andy Clark, who basically talks about the relationship between technologies and humans as being co-evolutionary. That, yeah, humans create technology, but that technology can then influence human behavior. Certainly, you can identify the technology which influenced post-World War II politics. The shape of the world was influenced by a technology. What was that technology? Not the car. Car was before World War II. But the shape of the world. Well, atomic bomb. Okay? Yeah, we created the atomic bomb, but then the atomic bomb created nations, created wars, created alliances. And now somebody else said, you can't understand the city of Los Angeles unless you understand that the car created Los Angeles. That technology basically created the outline of a whole city and how it was arranged. And then, of course, some technologies and their impacts go without saying. Television, okay? Yeah, we created television, but television's impact on our life is incredibly significant. Okay. But it is important that we do not have the technology predominate. But one of my themes here is that we take existing technologies that kids are using and leverage it for educational purposes. And some of those things you may not agree with, and that's where we want to get into a debate. There's a very good book, everybody should read it, called How People Learn. And it's basically a compendium of about 20, 25 years of research on what goes into successful learning. And it's a very good read, very quick, very succinct. And we have in the audience a person who developed a nice pictorial on this. I'm hoping the slide has your name on it. Some of them don't, I've noticed. Don Buckley. Don Buckley it's a wonderful, nice learning pyramid. Basically, I'm going to run this. I'm not going to read it to you, but I want you to see the pattern here. That if the more passive our intake of content, the less retention. The more interactive you become with that content, the more you retain. And if you look down at the bottom, sorry, I'll read the bottom. The bottom is simulating a real experience, doing the real thing. Doing it. Or having something, an experience which is so much like the real thing that you learn from that experience. So two dimensions here that I want to pursue is the notion of interactivity and the notion of immersiveness. How immersed is the student in that environment? The more they're immersed, the more, in fact, they learn. Learning is active. It's the difference between reading a newspaper, even reading a newspaper and watching television. When you read a newspaper, you look at the front page and you decide what you're going to read first. And you decide the speed at which you read. When you watch television, you don't get to decide what story you're going to hear, nor do you get to decide the rate. And what's shown is that the retention of just reading a newspaper, which is more active reading, commutes the content much more in television. In fact, there's a very famous study. People were shown a television news program. 30 minutes later, they were interviewed about what was on the news program. 90% of them did not remember one story. Okay. Learning is contextual. The more you give what you're trying to teach a context, the more the student will see and understand why it's important to learn that. The more that you put this into a world that's important to the student, the more they learn. And related to that, the more engaged the student is in the activity. And keep this one in mind because I'm going to talk about it when I get back to the question of immersion. The more engaged they are, the more they retain the information. Learning is interactive. Feedback. I give you this, you react to this. And I'm not just talking about any questions at the end of the period, which I'm doing in this session, so and this is very important. Learning is social, especially for this generation of students. It is not the case that they are content. I think Laurel made a reference to this. They're not content just to sit and get content from, say, a computer. That's not how they act. And this notion of social ability becomes very important when I talk about some of the new technologies that are used in teaching and learning. What we're trying to get on any campus, not talking about technology, is the formation of learning communities. Learning communities are interactive. They are united by a communality, a shared interest of some sort. However, even though there's a shared interest in communality, the learning community has a diversity of content and a diversity of content providers. So there's a community that's united by a common interest, but within that you've got a lot of stuff going on, okay, from a lot of different sources. I want you to remember this because a slide towards the end is going to revisit the whole concept of learning communities and what that means when we when we add technology. There's a wonderful article called The Next Generation, the Neo-Millennials, written by a Harvard professor named Chris Deedy. And it's in a book, an e-book, and the editors are James and Diana Oblinger. I bring this up because Diana is my boss and I have to do this. But because we're EDUCAUSE and pure, the book is free. It's called Educating the Next Generation. It's an e-book. And the URL, we're going to post this, Laurel. She got bored. You don't have to scribble these URLs down. We're going to post them somehow. This is a great book. Go to the EDUCAUSE site, download it for free. It has chapters. One of the scariest chapters is written by a student. And she's talking about her expectations. She goes to a university, and none of them are being met by her teachers. And she's very frustrated, and she goes back home for spring break. She talks to her younger brother, and her younger brother considers her a dinosaur because of all the stuff she doesn't know that he knows. But he has a very interesting article in this book, and basically he talks about 3 interfaces that affect how people learn. Now I'm going to use that as sort of the middle part structure of this talk. The first one is where we are right now. World to the laptop. Basically, if it's not too sunny a day, a student can sit out in front of this library and bring the world to his or her lap via a wireless connection, via library resources, whatever. Basically, we know about the fact it's content delivery. It also allows collaboration. That you can have students with laptops talk to each other and collaborate, build projects. By the way, I've always maintained, and I've seen this all over the place, if you really want students collaborating, you get one of those big beanbag chairs, big beanbags, and just plop it in the middle of the room. Students' butts will hit there with laptops, and they love it. We'll talk more about space in just a while. Mentoring. Okay. Not only is the world to the laptop, the professor is to the laptop, and that really sounded bad. Forget that image. But the fact is that, I've had people say, technology separates me from my students. Once I started using interactive stuff with my students, I learned a hell of a lot more than I really wanted to know about my students. I got to know them extremely well. I'm not even talking about My Place or Facebook. That's a whole different subject. But it allows communication. And if communication is dealing with education, it allows mentoring. And it allows the formation of virtual communities. And this is where our students are right now. Maybe students 2 or 3 years ago. And this is where we, as digital immigrants, we're getting used to it now and use these functions. This is only the first interface, though. Talk a little bit about the net generation. Characteristics, Phil Long has a wonderful phrase, they're highly deviced. I'm not saying that they're technologically savvy. That's a difference. And one of the things I'll rant a little bit about, and that's faculty's fault. But then it's not faculty's fault. Faculty are digital immigrants. We were not taught in our training how to critically examine web content. That wasn't part of our training. So how are we expected to make it part of our students' training? There's far too many instances of a professor saying, yes, you can use the internet to search this, and then give them nothing else. And it was when I did interviews with faculty here 5 or 6 years ago, there's a history professor who's no longer here, who actually showed me a paper a student had written on why the South had won the Civil War. And the professor had asked her, huh? She said, I did the research. I went back to original newspapers. He said, what? And she said, I cited it. He looks at the bottom, The Onion, which puts out fake newspaper things, and South wins war. It says something about her undergraduate, her high school training, but yeah, I mean, to her it's real. And we are not teaching the critical skills necessary for that, but that's off the subject. They're highly interconnected. Heard conversations with students, why haven't you answered my email? Oh, when did you send it? 5 minutes ago. Email is old hat to these people now. IM is where they are. Okay? They're highly interactive and also very highly social. More than, if you look at the millennials generation stuff, and you look at the net gen stuff, they really want personal interactions, not just virtual interactions. They want personal interactions. And that really can be shown, well, we'll do this first. Look at this. This is probably, this data is about a year old, so it's probably more. But look at the amount of time, on average, that these kids are spending consuming media. And look at this. 26% consume more than one medium at a time. Okay? Multitasking. Pardon? Yes, over a day. And yes, down the bottom, 49 minutes playing video games, 43 minutes of recreational reading. Kids are spending more time playing games than reading. Now, this is the notion of being highly deviced, but now throw in that notion that they're very social. And this is an interesting study done at UCF. This is a percentage of students who are very satisfied with getting their information totally on the web. As you see, that the older students are much more content with web-based delivery than the younger students. A couple of reasons for this. The older students are doing this because they're more goal-driven, and also because they have more maturity. Okay, because learning totally web-based stuff requires a lot of self-discipline. I haven't taught for a year, but I don't think that's changed in students. Right, yeah, right. It's still there. So just because they're highly deviced doesn't mean that they want all of their education done via technology. That's not what they want. They want face-to-face interactions with faculty, and they get frustrated when they don't get it. Now, I've talked about these four things. There's something missing here in this interface. In other words, this interface is a good way of delivering content, but it's not necessarily a good way to promote learning, because it lacks the concept of immersion. That it doesn't allow the student to see the context and become involved in what they're learning, to put themselves into what they're learning. It's still the world being delivered to them, but it's not their world. Dee Dee talks about the second interface, which he calls Alice in Wonderland multi-user virtual environments. This is Alice in Wonderland going down the rabbit hole and going to a very different environment. Immersion, what the jargon is, they go immersive simulated learning experiences, where the learner actually becomes part of the world where learning takes place. It's not seeing it from a third person, but actually becomes involved in it. How many people know about Second Life? 1, 2. I hesitate to tell you about Second Life because if you get involved in it, you may not come back to life number 1. And it's really amazingly exciting. Here's the URL. What we're seeing right now is the creation of a separate world. This is a map, and what people are doing is setting up environments where they actually have a role and interact with other people in the same role. Okay. So, for instance, the guy at the University of Kansas Medical Lab lives in this area, and he has a clinic. And so he has the doctor-patient. The doctor is paid by somebody in Denmark. The patient is paid by somebody in Oregon. And they basically simulate a doctor appointment with a patient. And it's a class on medical ethics. Econ. You can buy and sell real estate here. And econ departments are now using Second Life as a way of teaching basic economic principles of buying and selling. You could set up a university here. You could be the president. Or even more powerful, you could be the provost. Large amounts of money for that one. And the neat thing about this is that you could do, the boring thing of running a university, and then you could go out behind the university and fight a dragon. Okay, because somebody has a role as a dragon, and they're going around trying to mess other things up. It's a very interesting combination of reality and unreality. And it is very addictive. Warning. Which brings up the whole notion of where I think a lot of education is going, whether you like it or not. And that is, remember I talked about leveraging? That you take a platform that students are using for one thing, and you basically insidiously turn it to educational pursuits. We're seeing that with iPods. iPod, was set up to just transmit bad music to kids' ears. Okay. Well, now we're finding ways to sneak in education using iPod technology. We don't have to teach the kids iPod technology. Okay. Same thing with cell phones. Okay. Cell phones, if you ask your kids how many of them have cell phones, most of them do. Well, you can use these as interactive devices in a classroom. I've heard of clickers, where these are going to replace clickers. Don't invest in clickers. You basically can use this to have dial-in numbers and have that appear on the screen. Again, you're taking a technology that the kids know, and you're trying to use it for your own ill-gotten pursuits in education. You can see the same thing with gaming. First off, you have 65% who are either occasional or heavy. By the way, there is a gender difference. More males play games than females, by about 15, 20%. Okay? There are amazing things that go on in terms of games. The roles you play, how you interact with other people, and games are things they do in addition to other things. It's part of the multitasking environment. Other aspects of it, you learn stuff in games which you can then activate for further application. Games are contextual, obviously. They create a stimulating environment. The kids understand why they're there and what they have to do. Feedback and assessment. You do the wrong thing, you get stomped by the yellow troll. But your life has been saved, so you go back and try it again. Okay? Instant feedback, being smished. This is an important concept. You can transfer things learned in games. How many people in the Dark Ages played Myst? Myst was basically a logical puzzle game. And what they found in studies of Myst, people who played Myst, they came out much more improved analytically, able to solve problems, not Myst problems, but other problems in real life. The skills learned can transfer. And the final aspect of games is that, when we think of games, we think of a student in the dorm, residence hall, looking at their computer and in isolation to everything else. Games are extremely social. All you have to do is Google Second Life and look at all the things that have been created around Second Life. Have you heard of something called EverQuest? EverQuest is a big Dungeon Dragon type of game, alternative reality game, and the list I stopped at there must be 10,000 social sites dealing just with this game, not the game itself, but with people who were united because of that game. Games are highly social, and they can be very powerful. I have a friend who has a daughter going to college next year, and so we were commiserating, or perhaps celebrating, actually, when I think about that. And he's saying that he's tried for 4 years to get her to learn how to type. And she just won't do it. He got the software and everything, and she just would not do it. Until he discovered the typing of the dead. You are in a haunted house filled with flesh-eating zombies. You have a weapon that converts words into bullets. You have to, when these words show up, type them in before the zombie eats you. And they'll shoot the zombie. And of course, the words keep getting longer, and they keep coming faster. In a month and a half, she was at master's level in typing. Now, this is a skill. This is not knowledge. But what it's showing is that what he finally did was find a place where she was comfortable, where she enjoyed herself, and then snuck in training. And that's what's going to be happening with more and more games. There's a problem with games right now is that they're very expensive. And the game manufacturers don't look at the education market as being a very good market right now. Why? Because the normal faculty response is, I'm here to educate my students, not entertain them. Yeah, right. Well, my guess is people who say that probably aren't educating them either, but that's just a guess. And so there's not an educational market right now, but that doesn't mean that we can't turn existing games for educational purposes. And there's a very good site here called Social Impact Games, which basically goes down various disciplines, history, political science, biology, physics. I'm just looking at some of the people I know here in terms of botany, and they basically have games that can be applied to these fields. And they also, now this site is getting better because it's now doing evaluation and assessment of how effective these things are. Okay. What we're doing is trying to reach students where they live, not just because of the gaming environment they're playing games, but because gaming is a good way to get them to learn. Okay, it's not just that we're going there because they're playing. It's a very effective, it contains all those elements that how people learn have talked about. Engagement, context, reinforcement, all of that is in the gaming environment. But it gets better. Third level is ubiquitous computing. This is my term. I just like the word ubiquitous. What ubiquitous computing is dealing with is mobile computing using wireless devices primarily. And it's going to be not just in education, but in terms of just real life, the next big thing. Augmented reality is exactly what it sounds like. You take reality and you augment it with technology. And some of the most exciting stuff is being done at MIT. I'll just talk briefly about two of them. And as educators, you can start seeing the potential of this right away. And it's relatively inexpensive. And instead of telling what augmented reality is, I'll give you two examples. Maybe we'll come up. This is a handheld computer with a GPS on it. And what students in a class on ecology, they assemble in the middle of campus, and they say they go to a specific place on campus, and all of a sudden their computer says there has been a chemical waste spill right here. Now what you have to do is, and they give all the details, it says you have to hypothesize what the next area is going to be that's going to be affected by this spill. And the kids then physically go to the place that they hypothesize. When the coordinates are done, it's in the computer, and you say, no, you forgot about this. Now, if you add this in, where would you go? I've seen this in action. And you've got these groups of students going, whoop, 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 whoop. And what it is, it turns your entire campus into a classroom. Okay? You're not stuck in front of a computer anymore. You're actually involved in your own context. Another really fun one is the murder in the History Museum. Hark, there's been a murder. And what they have to do is go around the History Museum exhibits, stand in front of the exhibit, and then it gives a readout, and it gives them a clue about who killed this guy. But guess what it also does? It also tells them about the damn exhibit. Again, it's what I call insidious learning. We're sneaking it into them. And by the way, it's very much like the Da Vinci Code in terms of all this. Very much like that. And the kids eat it up. And the assessment we've seen over the last 4 years is incredible amounts of learning taking place because of this notion of immersion. Brian Alexander has an interesting term he calls swarm behavior. When the World Trade Organization had its meetings in Seattle and had all the riots, Alexander was there, and he noticed that big groups of students were physically moving together. And they were huddled around somebody in the middle, and then they'd move. What it is, the person would have a wireless device, read on it that so-and-so executive was leaving building on 5th Street. And they all would swarm and coalesce in the protest right there. Then another call would come, and part of the crowd would go this way, and part of the crowd would go that way. That's ubiquitous computing. Reingold calls them smart mobs. Mobs both in virtual and real reality, united by content. And he talks about these characteristics. That these mobs are very interconnected, very united in purpose and in interest, and can be very diverse. Okay? We're seeing more of these form as on the basis of immersive communications. Now, this may not seem like the same subject, but actually it has a lot to do with it. Given these new ways of interacting, you've got to seriously think about your learning spaces and what that means. Okay? And I'm especially interested in you thinking about informal spaces. When we talk about technology and learning, we tend to think about, okay, well, let's get smart podiums and everything like that. We keep forgetting that the majority of time the students spend here, they're not in the classroom. They're elsewhere. And what we have to get out of our heads is that learning takes place in the classroom. We have to create areas where learning can take place spontaneously. Again, it's sort of insidious learning. But create environments where the students feel comfortable interacting with each other. Right, Randy? What we're sort of looking for is to link the physical to the virtual and create, as a combination in the interface, a creative commons. Now, if this sounds familiar, it goes back to what I was talking about in terms of learning communities. Let's not talk about learning communities. Let's talk about learning communities that are distributed, that have both virtual and real connections. Okay? Basically, that the differentiation between the real and the virtual becomes less important, and the learning becomes more important. That's what we're talking about, and that's what we're looking for. We're not just looking for a community of getting people physically together. We're talking about a community of people sharing and mingling in all sorts of different informal and formal spaces. Now, a lot of this has been sort of bleeding edge stuff, but it's coming. And it's coming fast. I have to tell a story. When we were planning the 2005 ELI annual meeting in January. So we're talking about meeting in October of 2004. Somebody said, I got a great idea. Why don't we try to capture some of what's going on in this on MP3 files? And then people can play them later on, maybe on an iPod. Let's call them podcasts. That was October 2004. So when we were having our planning for the 2006 meeting, we met again in October 2005, and somebody said, well, let's do podcasting. And somebody looked at that person and said, podcasting? That is so April. I can't tell you how much that scared me to death, right? But the fact is that what we're seeing is a rapid change in what's going on. And we have a choice. More and more of the students are coming up here not just using this, but expecting to use this. And if we don't start looking at this reality and what it means in terms of our teaching and learning, students are going to go to other places that are doing it, okay, that get it. But one of the questions asked is, okay, all of this is happening, why isn't more interesting stuff happening on campus, on our campuses? And George Lucas had a very good quote. He asked the same question. He shouted this in a meeting. He said, why in the world are you still teaching like this and delivering content like this? There's nothing in a student's existence that matches them sitting for an hour and 15 minutes listening to one source of information. They don't do that anymore. We are teaching for students who no longer exist. And more that's going to be the case. Lucas has his finger on it. He has his finger on most things at the time, well, except for one. But there's not a quick answer to why are we stuck this way, but at least something for you to think about. Any guesses? 30? Higher. 50% are 24 years or below. Now, that's the easy question. How about this one? Madam Provost? 3? 0. Yeah. In fact, whenever I ask this question, the answer is usually 0. Okay? Okay, so if we do believe that students are fundamentally changing, they're being taught by people who haven't. And now the stickier question. Yeah, Randy. Any responses from those who are not full of it? I can't do that other places. What are we missing here? I mean, this is sort of like having a cooking class with no food. Almost all of the places I go, talking about what is important in teaching, we're missing one thing. We're missing the students. Nobody's talking to the students. Nobody's getting impact from the students. So we, as digital immigrants, are trying to devise new forms of teaching and learning without talking to the digital natives and finding out what they want. ELI has a neat thing we came up with about how to get student input in space. You get a bunch of students together, you give them those disposable cameras, and then we have a whole list of things for them to take. Take a picture of your favorite classroom. Take a picture of your least favorite classroom. Take a picture of your favorite chair. Take a picture of the place that has the most energy on campus, least energy. Then you can use a photo tagging software like Flickr, and basically you can array all the pictures of your senior female students where they go between classes. And the places that have done this, they look at it and say, I never understood that before. Students see things completely different. Okay? Students should be thought about as consumers as a choice. And by the way, the demographic bubble is going to start dipping, and we're going to get fewer and fewer students, and we're going to have to compete. We don't have to compete right now, so nobody talks about quality education. They will again. Okay? Don't think that they see the world like you saw the world when you were a student. The world has changed. The world is different. So don't put your assumptions in their heads because it's not going to work. There are lots of places that just get opinions, and some of them have very high action. The students at the University of Washington, we learned yesterday, control how their technology fee is spent. Totally control it. That's a good idea. Why don't we do that here? Okay, this slide has far too much on it. It says here language and perspectives differ. You've got to talk to more than one student. Don't get a student on a damn committee and say, well, we got student input. That doesn't work like that. Committees don't work like that. Okay, so I'm not just talking about having a token student. We're talking about having active ways of generating student interest and student needs. And by the way, it says to spend the day in their shoes. Forget that. Foremost, talk about learning on campus. You know, it's funny. Our job here is to educate, to have students learn, but it's not part of our dialogue. It's sort of like I imagine how it was in Victorian England about sex. You know, everybody knew it was happening, but nobody talked about it. Well, on campus, everybody knows that learning is taking place, but there's no dialogue about learning. This is especially a problem with faculty, because faculty don't know how to talk about what they do, because they haven't had that experience. Most faculty have this notion, like the reporter, the nose for news, that type of thing, that you're a born faculty member. So they don't have self-examination. And it shouldn't really start there. It should be part of a wider campus dialogue. Okay? Your institution is going to be dealing with strategic planning, dealing with technology. Okay? Getting forums talking about teaching, what that means and what learning means, is a good way to inform that process. Don't just have a token student on the committee. Have ways to have that dialogue occur on campus, and then have ways to have that dialogue funneled upwards. Do podcasts. Do podcasts with students. I want to sit down and talk to you about learning. And then do a harvesting of what those podcasts say. Relatively easy, very straightforward. This is a simple thing. We're interested in student success. If we keep doing things the way we're doing, we're going to be less and less successful, is what I'm talking about. And how do systems do this? Well, it's not done grassroots. I've done a lot of studies, not a lot of studies, done a lot of looking at, this is my next to last slide, by the way. I've done a lot of looking at institutions that have done it, have created a culture of talking about learning, and started to adjust against the stream that's going down. They have three things in common. All of them have three things in common. First off, leadership that's committed. Leadership is saying, okay, you go down this way, I'm going to support you. Part of reward structure, whatever. This is not something that's a fad. This is something we're committed to. Inclusion. Especially for faculty. Faculty don't like things imposed upon them. Faculty need to be part of the process, staff has to be made part of the process, and students have to be made part of the process. You can't leave them out. And finally, communicate what you're doing. Let people know something really interesting is happening on campus. And they'll want to get involved because it deals with something that we're interested in, that's student success. So leadership, inclusion, and communication. I say that all the time. Unfortunately, the acronym is LIC. To deal with something like that. But, okay, we have time for questions.